So, thank you. I'm glad to be back. It feels like I'm here a lot, and now I'm back again. I have nothing financially to disclose. One day I'll work on that. So I am talking about laboratories test stewardship, a marriage of patient safety and financial integrity. And because I'm up here giving this talk, I thought I'd share my favorite wedding photo. That is me and my husband, Seth. And I like this photo a lot because it represents, to me, a realistic picture of what marriage can be. It's not always cake and flowers and posed pictures. It can be a little bit tangly at times, and you have to work at it. And I think that's an excellent metaphor for laboratory stewardship, both for what our goals are and for the teamwork that is required. There will be conflict. You need compromise and compassion. And so for the next 40-ish minutes or so, think of me like your marriage counselor for laboratory stewardship. I want to share with you some new guidelines that hopefully will help places sustain their implementation of hospital lab stewardship programs. Now, Mike mentioned that we've been working on changing the vocabulary. I don't know if I can take credit for the word. It's definitely not a new word, but it is important, I think, to recognize that language matters. And the first step of this counseling session is that some words can be less inclusive, and people don't like to be managed. And utilization management has, over the years, developed somewhat of a reputation to be cost-focused, against providers, against getting patients what they need. So this word, it's the same stuff that we've all been doing for decades, just a new word that implies teamwork. It implies the fact that we do have limited resources, that we're stewards of our resources in the healthcare system, and that is what we'll be talking about today, how to implement that. The goals of laboratory stewardship are the same as what it's previously known as laboratory utilization management. We want to improve patient safety and reduce patient harm in these main areas. The top 3 causes of lab-related litigation are misordering tests. That can be ordering the wrong test, ordering too many tests, not ordering a test is also misordering, misinterpreting the test result, and then sadly, ultimately failing to retrieve or act on that test result. And we also aim to improve the financial impact both to patients and the hospital systems overall. Now, from a stewardship standpoint in our healthcare system, we have a lot of company. I think this is reassuring to know that for decades, many different areas, if not all of them in the healthcare system, have been working towards similar goals. We've seen it in pharmacy, we've seen it in blood utilization committees, radiology, and the recent web hit, the Choosing Wisely campaign, and also the antimicrobial stewardship. So I think this list is a testament to the fact that we're not alone. It also, if I were a pessimist, I might say this is also a testament to the fact that we can't sustain the rising healthcare costs that we have, and many places within the healthcare system are worried about it. I might even show one of those dramatic graphs that plot different countries and show where U.S. is in various healthcare outcomes, suggesting that maybe the money that we're spending doesn't necessarily correlate to best patient outcomes. But I'm not a pessimist. And it's 3:30, so I don't want to depress everyone for the afternoon. So let's focus on the positive, which is that we are not alone, and we have a lot of colleagues that we can learn from, especially most recently the antimicrobial stewardship movement. Now, I am a chemist, so save your questions or critiques till the end on my description of what I think is relevant about the antimicrobial stewardship movement. Interestingly, since the discovery and implementation of penicillin, the dosing time of a week, standard 7 days, was pretty much worldwide standard, and it wasn't necessarily evidence-based at the time because there wasn't a lot of evidence. So it was just thought that that was the best thing to do. And despite the patient's symptoms, you were to continue that dosing. Over time, of course, we know that this has led to a new disease, the antibiotic resistance syndromes that we're seeing across the spectrum and across different types of populations and with different types of organisms. So we now know that, and we've known probably for decades, leaders in that field, that we could be doing it better and finding better ways to identify dosing intervals. But it took a long time to get that education out, and education wasn't necessarily successful, especially since the patient harm outcome wasn't exactly tied to the patient sitting in front of the provider who was making the decision at the time. And so that had led to the government getting involved. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, we have yet to see, but they have made a great national stage for the antimicrobial stewardship movement, and now there's standards that went into effect in January. And these standards, I think, are particularly relevant to the laboratory stewardship movement because they don't tell places what medication to use, when, or how, but just that there should be certain infrastructure in place within hospitals to make the best decision for that population at that time. And so that's what the standards outline. And we were particularly inspired by our colleague, Dr. Scott Weissman at Seattle Children's, who presented and have talked with us over the years about the efforts of our program at Seattle Children's and how this national movement has impacted them. And so we know from our program at Seattle Children's, from the work that you all have done at the University of Washington and many places across the country, the literature is full of stories of successful laboratory stewardship examples and the impact that it can make locally. And we've seen that in our own story, just 5 years since Mike and I started advancing on the systems that were already in place at Seattle Children's. We have a weekly meeting, which I'll talk more about later. We quickly saw that a case review process could find order modification rate of 25% in all the cases that we reviewed. Over a few years, we grew even more. We reached $1 million in cost avoidance from that review program. Up until just most recently, we've expanded the review process to, at the time of pre-authorization, which is no small feat. And we also established a hospital-wide committee and have created partnerships with our local insurance companies. All of this to say that you can do a lot locally, and we should continue to do a lot locally, but the real impact that we aim to have, that we want to have, is national. We want to be like the antimicrobial stewardship movement that's out there in the media, getting attention, getting regulations behind them to improve the utility of laboratory tests. And so we coordinated PLUGS, which is now Patient-Centered Laboratory Utilization Guidance Services. We call it PLUGS because it's a little bit of a mouthful. And it represents our the change from pediatric to patient-centered happened earlier this year, just to better represent our membership, over half of which is mixed adult pediatric health systems, not unlike the University of Washington, as well as standalone children's hospitals and other national reference laboratories. And our goal here is to get that national impact by strengthening the local impact throughout the country, but also at the policy level, at the national level. And we aim to do that through 4 main value propositions. So we began PLUGS because the people were struggling. The people on the feet, people on the floor were struggling with getting their programs up and running. So we began developing tools for stewardship program development, and that's really where the heart of the organization started. But to make that national impact, we've expanded also to case management. So there's a fee-based service through a partnership with Metis that will help programs who can't do their own case review. There's insurance advocacy, where we have a variety of committees working together to build national policies for a variety of specific conditions and tests. Just recently, we wrote an exome policy that has now been implemented through EviCore, covering 9 million lives. So that's 9 million lives that didn't have exome coverage before that now do. And that's the type of impact that we're continuing. But for today, I'll be talking about the work from our National Committee for Laboratory Stewardship, this one right here, which has put forth these new guidelines and standards to help with the infrastructure of laboratory stewardship programs within a hospital setting. So this committee is made up of members from 6 different institutions representing major reference laboratories like ARUP and Mayo, academic centers like Cleveland Clinic, University of Michigan, and children's hospitals, ourselves, of course, and Texas Children's. And like most committees, we spent several meetings writing these 2 sentences here for the mission and vision statement. I really like the vision statement, though. I think it wraps up the goal of what this committee hopes to do through these standards, which is to promote and enable the highest standards of effective test utilization in every clinical setting. We dream big. And what this has ultimately come down to recently was the first step was publishing a set of standards in the Journal of Applied Laboratory Medicine. And what these standards, which I'll walk through, will basically cover the 4 main elements which are critical to a successful hospital laboratory stewardship program. And they are governance, interventions, of course, data extraction and monitoring, and review and improve. So the committee has done all this in the past 18 months. And what our goal is now is to begin to disseminate these standards, like what I'm doing today, and gathering feedback from the professional community, and then turning those standards into checklists, with the goal that ultimately these checklists will be part of an accreditation program similar to what the Antimicrobial Stewardship Movement has done with the Joint Commission. We could perhaps partner with CAP or other accrediting agencies, perhaps ourselves, to get these standards bought off on by organizations, which would ultimately improve the reimbursement for these settings. That's just the big goal. So now we'll move into what the standards actually are. Governance is the most critical, I think, of the 4 elements, because you can't be successful with the other 3 without having a strong infrastructure in place. And the infrastructure requires a variety of different pieces to optimize the success. The first and foremost is leadership commitment within the organization. This can mean a lot of different things depending on the organization, but ultimately it's the commitment that there will be support and resources devoted to the program. This can be wrapped up into the committee structure, which is the example that I'll talk about in a moment. You also need accountability to a higher level medical executive. And again, this can take a lot of different forms, but working through the committee is a good way. Having accountability to a higher level medical executive outside the lab within the organization gives you a place to have escalation to, and gives it the integrity, so to speak, the justification that it's not a lab-driven thing, that it means something to the organization and not just the lab. Of course, you need a variety of expertise. You can't have a committee just entirely of laboratory personnel, and you can't have a committee that excludes laboratory personnel. So you need everyone, clinicians, IT support, financial support, the major representatives of the decision-making leaders of the hospital need to be represented. And then, of course, the thing that we do best is the networking, and that's going to meetings, being a leader in the field, talking to other leaders in the field, and making sure that you are up to date. So in the committee structure, I just want to take a moment to describe what's happening at Seattle Children's. And there's lots of different versions. There's many ways to do this. Ours is slightly based on a very successful structure that was described by Henry Ford. But the top of the hierarchy is the Utilization Review Committee. Most places have this committee because it's required by CMS. And this committee is not just, it's dedicated to all different utilization of various healthcare resources and is a good place to feed up work from laboratory stewardship. Like most hierarchies, all the work is done at the bottom here with our working committees. And these committees feed up into the Hospital Lab Stewardship Committee. The Hospital Lab Stewardship Committee includes all those personnel that I was mentioning before to get the leadership support. So we have the Vice President of Medical Affairs, who's a provider, the Chief Medical Information Officer, a chief inpatient provider to represent the needs of the inpatient providers, the Director of Revenue Cycle, and laboratory medical leadership. And then we invite other expertise as needed, which I'll give an example of in a moment. So the working committee, which is what we first formed several years ago, meets weekly, whether or not it's a holiday. You know what? We are hard workers, and it doesn't matter who's there. We meet every week. We have pathologists, chemists like myself, a gaggle of genetic counselors, medical geneticists, specialty laboratory managers, business operations, and the clinical genetic counselors are represented as well. This meeting has a standing working agenda, which is updated every week and keeps everybody on track if we're successful in running it, which most of the time we are. We go over case review every week, not every case, but similar to call rounds, where you select cases that are either interesting or you'd like additional feedback on. We talk about which new tests we should define, which trends we've been noticing, and any specific interventions or projects that we're working on. A lot gets done at this meeting, generally speaking. And then this meeting sets the agenda for the Hospital Laboratory Stewardship Committee. So when we formed it just recently in January, we assured our hospital leaders that we didn't need them to do any extra work, that we were very successful in managing 90% of laboratory stewardship issues which come our way, but that ultimately we believe that there are certain decisions which shouldn't be made by the laboratory, that they really need to come from the institution and have policies, institutional policies that back them up, and that's where this committee comes in. So we don't need to meet that frequently. We meet quarterly, and it's a forum for where we feel like, where we bring them decisions to be made that we really would like to be owned by the hospital. And of course, we tell them what decision to make, and most of the time they agree. So for example, the meetings that we've had so far was establishing a new test that our transplant providers requested, Pleximmune. Anything that sounds like Pleximmune we get suspicious of and want to be further assessed. We had a very intense and controversial discussion regarding perimortem genetic testing policy, which was helpful to have laboratory hospital leaders involved in that decision. This next meeting we're having will be getting an institutional policy in writing about what is and is not acceptable regarding free testing from, haven't used air quotes in a while, free testing from a variety of commercial laboratories or research laboratories. That's just a flavor. So once there's some sort of governance system established, and I wouldn't spend a year perfecting it, you get something started so that you can make meaningful progress and then revisit if you need to change the structure. The meat of the work, of course, is done within interventions. We like to classify interventions into their categories by strength or of effectiveness. So they range from weak interventions, which are not very effective, as standalone interventions up to strong interventions. And unfortunately, the categorization of their effectiveness, I think, has a correlation with their easiness to implement. So of course, it's easier to implement the weak interventions, although they may not be as effective. I see now that gentle is a better word. Let's call them gentle interventions and not weak. Anyway, some examples would be educational efforts where you maybe go and give a presentation, you send out an email or two, you put up pop-ups. Those are all considered gentle, easy to implement interventions. Medium includes actually changing the requisition. For places that have CPOE, that would be moving things around in power plans or hiding things so that it's easier to order the right thing and harder to order the wrong thing. And strong interventions include a lot of that governance structure to implement well. You could establish report cards like you all have done here. Privileging is a strong intervention where experts are allowed to order the expert test, but not anyone else. Having a laboratory formulary, there's lots of literature on successful tiering approaches to formularies. And then, of course, requiring higher level approval or a consultation for tests that meet specific criteria. Recently, one of our PLUGS members, Children's Mercy Hospital, made a publication in the Medical Laboratory Management magazine, which came out, and we were very happy to see that they implemented Choosing Wisely recommendation and saw really nice reduction in co-ordering of ESR and CRP. This is a common co-ordering pattern that we hear about as a problem from most of our members. We still are doing it ourselves at Seattle Children's. For whatever reason, it is controversial. And so we were excited to see the progress they made and that they used Choosing Wisely. You know, they prioritized, found a recommendation from Choosing Wisely, and then went at it. So the recommendation is to not co-order ESR with CRP in patients with undiagnosed conditions, that CRP is the better test. And so what they did was they implemented a series of interventions, because more interventions will always be more successful than just one. And the first thing they did was education. So they just told everyone what was the better test. So that's our educational gentle intervention. And then they removed it from all the order sets, except for the ones where it might be relevant. And so that's a medium intervention where they're changing CPOE to help providers choose the right thing. And then the strong thing that they did was that they involved their clinicians and got them to own the project. So the ED clinicians began to review whether or not it was truly necessary in the musculoskeletal infections, and they adopted the appropriate use of ESR as a goal for their department in 2016. And these interventions together ultimately resulted in a 50% reduction in co-ordering of ESR and CRP for their institution. So we were really happy to see that for them. And jealous, but mostly happy, but also jealous. The strong intervention that we've been working on a lot is case review for genetic tests, specifically because they are costly and error-prone. And maybe it's a bigger financial problem in pediatrics than in other settings, but we spend quite a bit of money annually on genetic send-out tests. And we thought that if we were to review them and have conversations with providers regarding their necessity, we could improve appropriate testing for the patients. And so we all have, we've been hearing about this for a while. That is me shocked at how dynamic this testing market is. I would have changed, if I knew anything about computers, I would have changed that to be like a magazine or something about increasing test orders. But there's like 5 new tests a day on the market. There's a lot to choose from. It's impossible to keep up. Even if you are a highly skilled genetic counselor, you can't know everything. And it's expensive. And we're seeing it more and more. It's not just medical geneticists ordering these tests anymore because they're being developed for a variety of conditions that's appropriate for non-geneticists to order, but it's also hard to manage and it's hard to keep on top of. And so it makes sense to have experts involved in taking a look. We saw the first white paper come out of ARUP several years ago when we were just beginning the program, and that's what inspired us to take on this effort for our own practice. ARUP saw in reviewing their reference sample orders that a third of these orders were wrong and that they could correct them, save the client money, the patient's money, and reduce unnecessary testing. We've seen that over and over. Mayo came out with their paper not too far behind, because what ARUP does, Mayo will do. Then prevention genetics. And then the literature in the hospital setting is also growing. We published our first 150 cases 5 years ago and saw that same modification rate. Cleveland Clinic saw the same modification rate. Patrick came to do a rotation with us and looked not actually just how much we were modifying, but why, and analyzed on the orders that we were detecting and correcting through the review process. And I like to tease Carlos Suarez, our previous resident, for being last, and their Stanford last makes me happy, and their work as well. So everyone is seeing this, and it's really an established benefit to have a program catch these errors. One specific case, we have 6,000 to choose from, but I like this example just to demonstrate the nuance that's involved in this type of case review. So in this case, we have a 12-year-old. He's being admitted for hypoglycemia secondary to hyperinsulinism. He has seizures, and he's evaluated by endocrinology and a bunch of other services because they don't know why. And so they want to rule out a genetic etiology versus an insulinoma. So we see on an inpatient order 8 different genetic tests being ordered concurrently. One of these tests is GLUT1. Our genetic counselors reviewing the case noted that GLUT1 is the protein name. It's associated with a gene, the SLC2A1 gene, which is associated with de vivo disease. This is not the same test as GLUT1. So just take out T, put in a D. That's a different protein, a different gene that's associated with hyperinsulinemic hypoglycemia. All in the medical record, the provider referenced GLUT1. So even if it were someone like me reading the chart to make sure that the provider was ordering the right thing, I wouldn't have caught that because I don't know my proteins in my genes to that degree. But the genetic counselors do. And they just called the provider, said, hey, we noticed this. Did you intend for GLUT1? And she's like, oh, yes, of course I intended that. That's the right disease. So aside from the fact that all 8 genes were negative, we did get the right test for the patient and a meaningful negative result. And so what we do now is we review send-out tests which cost the lab more than $700. We review all genetic tests, including our in-house genetic tests. We review all miscellaneous test requests, and then tests which are sent to a laboratory which is not defined, tests sent to international laboratories, and tests sent out which we actually perform in-house, and then a host of other tests which we just say we should probably take a look at that before it goes out for a variety of different reasons. And this case review process is illustrated here in this chart, which I will use my mouse. So these blue boxes represent the process for the in-house genetic lab testing. When the sample gets into the lab GCs review the pending list, review the case, talk to the provider about half the time, and then make an adjudication. When the send-out test is received by our send-out lab, they will enter some information into a database. Then that case populates a queue, whether or not it's genetic test or a not genetic test, and then that case gets reviewed. about half the time we have to pick up the phone and get more information. And then about a third of the time, a quarter of the time, we're modifying an order, either modifying it to a different test or canceling it entirely. When the case review is done, we say that it's done in the database, and then that populates a different queue. And so the sendouts team knows that the case review is completed, and then they can process it accordingly. So now is where I'm going to show you our new fancy database implemented this March, designed in part by Sinan, who some of you know, who designed your case database as well. And our greatest asset in the lab, which is our senior data scientist, Paul Hirawa. So this is what the sendout team sees. They don't have to enter in a bunch of information, just who is the patient, who ordered it, what did they ask for, and if the test is genetic or not. And then that goes to the appropriate queue. And then once the case review is completed, and it looks just like yours, where we enter in demographics, clinical utility, any conversations that we've had that were relevant, and then the sendouts team will see an easy red or green box which tells them they can send it out as it was ordered, or that there's been a change that was made and recommended. So this is where y'all go, ooh, so fancy. The best part about this database is it really did help solidify the workflow, because many places will get stuck on how do you know what was ordered, who's telling you, how are you tracking it, and then of course all this data is fed into Tableau, which is how we manage the data, which is next. So the next piece, once you have your interventions in your beautiful governance system, then you have to find a way to get the data out and to monitor and make sure that the interventions are having the impact that you intended. Ideally, in an ideal world, we would monitor all these things. We would look for the appropriateness of the test order. We would make sure that the result was being interpreted correctly and that it was being retrieved and acknowledged in a timely fashion, and that the intervention had an impact that we could measure and monitor. Now, the appropriateness of test orders and the impact of the stewardship interventions are the pieces that I'll focus on. We have spent a lot of time looking at retrieval of lab results, which I won't be talking about today. And this appropriateness of result interpretation, I would love to hear your thoughts or ideas on efficient ways to do that. I think it's an ideal state that we'd love to get to. So in terms of the appropriateness of orders, we have a close look on what orders we're modifying. Every week we report up at our laboratory huddle how many cases we modified and what impact that had from a financial savings perspective. This is 6 years worth of data here, September to September, 2011 to 2017, and we've maintained consistently that approximately 25% modification rate over the time of our 5-year program. So again, we're approving most of the orders. 74% go out as ordered. We're modifying about 15% and canceling about 12%. We also track why we're modifying or canceling an order, and this is helpful for communication with providers and getting buy-in, because we're not modifying things for cost all the time. We're modifying because it's the wrong test, or because it had already been ordered, or because we found a better test, which maybe is more expensive, or we're modifying the testing strategy to a sequential approach. And so we track all of that over time. This is the important work that Patrick Mathias completed during his fellowship time at Seattle Children's, where we examined who's ordering tests wrong and why, and what impact. So he defined order error as a diagnostic error. If that test had been ordered and sent, it would have made a difference to the patient's management. Either they wouldn't have known the information they intended to find out, or even something more serious. Interestingly, we found that inpatient setting from genetics providers had the highest order error rate. And that's because they knew the right thing to do, but that our residents and trainees are the ones actually doing the ordering, and these are complicated tests to order. And so this, I think, shows a weakness in most academic settings, systems, where the right people necessarily aren't doing the work. And so we don't privilege geneticists. We watch their orders too, because there's lots of proxy ordering in our system. And then, of course, genetics outpatient have the lowest order error rate. And that makes sense because they're the ones doing the ordering. So we have spent a lot of time thinking about the work that we're doing in terms of our laboratory genetic counselor support. We're lucky to have 4, and we justify this through our cost avoidance and our patient safety impact by correcting errors. And we share this with PLUGS members as well to help them justify this role. We aren't the only ones doing this work, as the literature suggests, and it's worthwhile, and the ROI is significant. But if you look at our financial impact over time, you'll notice we're not seeing a decrease. The requests that we are getting go up every day. The cost of these tests are going up every day. We have yet to see a $1,000 genome, and so we're bending the curve over time. And I think we're still able to justify, but we're not. The way this field is growing, we're not going to get to a downward slope. It only looks like that here because 2017 isn't complete yet. So we're in October. I think that'll bounce back up. So the red line is cost requested. The blue line is the cost that we've sent. So the difference between the red and the blue is our cost avoidance. The orange line is the number of cases that we're reviewing. And it's going up, which is great for patients. We have a dashboard which we track all of these things, and we track turnaround time of our case review process because we don't want to be a bottleneck or cause delay in that system. We're able to look at requests over time, who's ordering, and this enables us to be flexible and dynamic in our program and make changes when we see trends happen. So the last step is to have some type of maintenance, to review and improve your laboratory stewardship program. And there's many different ways to do this. I think one of the pieces, of course, it's tied very closely to the data, but to also have a structure within the committee to know about prioritization, to make sure that the process for driving the interventions and the direction of the program makes sense, and that it isn't just the loudest person or the research interests of certain people, that it's supportive of the organization's goals. And another piece of review and improve is to be connected with the stakeholders, so the providers who are involved, the patients who are involved, and we've done that through gathering feedback through annual surveys. And this is a survey that we send out to every provider that we interact with through the case review process and other ways that our utilization management program works. And then we ask them a series of questions to make sure that we're having the impact that we hope to have, but also we use the survey as a way to get feedback about changes in the program. So we will highlight, hey, this thing has changed. A, do you all know about it? And B, is it a change that is that you're okay with? And we get lots of responses, which is helpful in monitoring and changing our program as we need. So we've conducted the survey every year since 2013. We have a relatively good response rate of about 50%, which I think is shocking when you're talking about busy care providers. And we have now we have a process in which we share the results back as well. So this is an example of this past year's survey where the colors represent how happy the providers are. So green is a very happy or satisfied, extremely satisfied feeling. Pink is a lot. This blue, purpley color is neutral, and then the orange and the dark green are a little or maybe not so much. And the yellow is that NA, so the provider didn't respond. So one piece of the survey that I want to point out, because it's changed dramatically over the years, is this question: is cost important to you in test selection? Initially, this was a big part of the program, of saying, hey, did you know this test cost this much? And we would get a, wow, no, I had no idea. And that would be the end of it. And that has changed over time. So now when we ask, do you want to know about cost? We've been around a while, and we've learned that providers they've heard the cost story. They don't want to hear the cost story anymore. Cost is not a meaningful motivator in their decision-making process. So now we see about a quarter of our respondents they feel neutrally, because we're at Seattle Children's, they won't feel negative. They feel neutral about cost. If you compare that to last year, we had 14% felt neutral. So we have a 10% shift, which I think is an underrepresentation just because of our culture. So anyway, this is helpful information. It helps us develop communication strategies, and it helps us know what's important to our stakeholders so that we can focus on those pieces. We can also share our survey. It's designed in REDCap, so many places have the survey tool, and then we can compare results across institutions as well. This past year, we compared with Health Partners, which is a very different system than Seattle Children's. It's a healthcare conglomerate in Minnesota, and yet we see remarkably similar responses for the types of questions that we're asking. Again, here's the cost question. We want to know, do they find information regarding our modification strategies useful? Were they happy with interactions that they've had? Those type of questions. So in conclusion, I think none of these things are rocket science, but they're all important in putting together a successful hospital laboratory stewardship program. You need a clear structure and accountability within the hospital organization. You need to be evidence-based focused and patient-centered. So thinking ultimately what is best for the ultimate stakeholder, which is the patient. You need to be data-driven, not anecdotally, and you need to have a strong sense of collaboration. And you can take all of these things and apply it to your marriages as well. I think there's a place for that. I do want to close with one last intervention, which we have not implemented ourselves, but it's another learning from the antimicrobial stewardship movement. I don't know if you all have heard about it, but it's the idea called Handshake stewardship, and this is my goal for the next year. I'm going to say year, but what I mean by year is 5 years, because it takes a long time to do anything. But the idea here is that there's no restrictions, there's no privileging. Providers order what they need. In this case, it's antimicrobials. But on a regular basis, there's a meeting. There's rounding for the patients, for all the patients who had antibiotics ordered, and the providers who ordered them, and the pharmacists give feedback, and they say, you might want to change this to that, or you might want to not put this patient on that, or change the duration on that. And the providers can choose to take the recommendation or not, but it's a face-to-face interaction. And just that face-to-face interaction, they saw a significant reduction in days of therapy over time in this study. And I think the idea, their hypothesis that it was so successful was based on the fact that it is relationship-based, and there's a face in front of you helping you, and not judging or managing or otherwise stopping you from doing your job. And that even when drugs weren't ordered, they still would go and say, hey, great job. Are there any questions that you want to ask our team? And it was successful. And I think we could learn from this in the laboratory, being kept in the basement in some cases. We could do a better job of having more face-to-face interaction. So I'll leave you with that. We have a large team. Most of them are here, so I want to thank them all for their support. This is a large group of hard workers, and we do a lot together. Most people who visit us say that they've never seen a team work like ours, and I think that's true. So thank you, and don't forget to get your credits.
Questions for Jay? And Jay, will you repeat the question for the...
I think there's a mic now. There's a mic.
No.
Oh, no. It's not about antimicrobials, is it? Oh. So the turnaround time for a case review, we have a goal to keep it within 48 business hours, but most of the time it's completed same day. And then, of course, we have a policy to send it out when in doubt, and also to pay close attention to sample stability when that is an issue. Yes, no.
Hi, Jane. Great talk. Have you noticed any patterns among the institutions that you've collaborated with and helped that suggest there are certain incentives or disincentives in place in the institution that lead an institution towards stewardship or away from stewardship? I'm thinking things like the extent of capitation for testing or other features of governance. I mean, what are sort of the big patterns that you see that leads an institution to want to do this or creates obstacles?
Well, I will say there's multiple buckets that you could put organizations into. One bucket is the top-down bucket, where their motivation is driven by budgets, and it's driven top-down, so from the organization. And the lab is told, this is a problem, you need to fix it. And then they join plugs and we help them. And we have parties and we're a lot of fun. So that is one bucket. And then the other bucket is where the lab is saying, we see a problem, we would like to address it. Either it's patient complaint driven, or it's their laboratory budget driven, or it's patient safety trends that they've noticed, and they need help getting institutional buy-in. And then there's probably other buckets where it's a combination of those. Those I think are the two extremes. And the challenges, I think, are the same. Data is always a challenge. Fear of reputation and implementation, and how do you actually do it, and will everyone be mad at me, is a challenge. And logistically, organizing can be a challenge. So the places where it's been most successful are places where the culture is ready, and health partners, for example, they joined plugs. They hired 2 genetic counselors that year. They're a health system, so they're used to being managed in that degree, and they were ready culturally for a process that would involve some extra case review, and then they've been extraordinarily successful. And also they're Minnesotan, so I think that that plays into the friendly factor. But I don't know, does that answer your question? If you guys want to jump in, there's a mic.
Thanks, Jane. A question on where the cost effectiveness of the level of staffing and review starts to drop off. So you had your, I think your cutoff was $700 with other tests, and then I think your ROI that you showed was $1,000. So was your lower. So how low can you go before you actually start losing money on these interventions?
Yeah, so I think that's, the short answer is I have not modeled that to the degree that you're asking, but I can offer some insight, which is that the ROI depends on some assumptions, that it will take a certain amount of time to review a case, and that you're going to modify a certain percentage of those. And so you can do the math to make sure from that cost perspective, and you also know the salary of the people that you've employed. So we did do that math to some degree for our first publication in 2013 to demonstrate that you can maintain that cost savings. But there is a point, and we've heard, I can't remember the member who described it, Michigan, where there's the the dollar test or it's not worth reviewing every CBC, for example. It's not worth pathologists' time to review even wrong things that are done in high volumes. But you can do system-wide changes for those, so where it doesn't involve a person reviewing it. So you do have to consider that balance when designing the case review. And then there's other tangible benefits which are harder to quantify, like the miscellaneous test review that we're doing right now has no cost threshold. It's every miscellaneous test. We're doing a quick check to make sure that the right lab is chosen, that it was meant to be a miscellaneous test, because people write down, thyroid antibody, for example, and what they mean is the standard test we do in-house, but what Sendouts interprets that is some rare receptor antibody that you send to one lab in the world. So it's things like that that you can just quickly change. And then the workflow piece that we have built around is getting the billing in place for miscellaneous tests, which for those of you who are involved in that process, it's time consuming in and of itself. And so if you bill the wrong thing, that's hours of rework. And so getting it done right the first time, if it's a pathologist doing it or a doctoral level person doing it, it matters, I think, in the long run.